Good evening. My name is Dr. Michael Westendorf, and I'm going to speak with you this evening about forage quality. I like to give this quote: "We can finish beef on many kinds of forage as long as it is grazed in an immature stage, when it is leafy and high quality, with adequate density of stand that the cattle can take big bites." What's that mean? It means really we want to be able to graze our animals when the forages are relatively immature, they're green, they're leafy, they're growing. There haven't been a lot of stems develop in our pastures yet, and we've got a good stand, a good thick, lush stand of forage, and that allows our animals to get maximize intake and to maximize performance. If we're able to produce the kind of forage that Dr. Undersander mentioned, our animals grazing good, leafy, lush, high stand forage, we're going to increase the dry matter consumption on our animals. They're going to consume more pasture, more forage. That increased dry matter intake is going to result in improved performance and weight gain. They're going to perform better. It's going to reduce feeding. If we have to supplement diets with hay or with grain, we're going to decrease the amount that we actually have to do that. And finally, we're going to decrease our feed costs. We have to purchase less forage, less extra grain. Our feed costs will be diminished. Well, of course, good quality forage. You can see a group of beef steers out here grazing, going to result in good growth. When we do what we're trying to do and produce good forage, good immature, leafy, not a lot of stems, our animals are going to grow. It's also going to support reproduction in this group of ewes. You can see the forage here has been well grazed, but it appears to still have pretty good, decent growth. Of course, we can use forages for some other species. These are some animals, some pigs, some sows that were taken on the Rutgers University campus, and they're grazing some not the greatest forage, but it's able to support some forage for some growth for both gestating and lactating pigs. And of course, it's possible to graze poultry on pasture as well. Pasture's got to be very high quality because we need just that very good immature growth for chickens. If it gets too old and stemmy, they're not going to consume as much. They're not going to perform as well. So, but we can promote egg production as well. And finally, we can, pleasure and performance in horses. Look at this pasture. This is a very good, green and lush. I think Dr. Williams gave me this slide. And you can see these animals, these horses look to be in good condition, grazing those pastures. Here's a nice picture of a New Jersey spring pasture. It's well vegetated. It looks great. You can see that it's good and green and pretty lush. It's a thick stand. There's a little bit of clover growing in it. As opposed to this pasture, which is pretty much of bad news all around. When we can, we want our pastures to be vegetated well enough to take up nutrients and to provide cover for the ground in case of rain, so you don't get mud development. And this pasture is not going to do any of that. Animals that defecate in this area or manure that gets spread in that area is just going to be a mess. Well, how do we best determine forage quality? Appearance, odor, chemical analysis, maturity and stage of harvest, plant species or variety. Appearance, I would grade only say a fair to poor. Mostly just a fair at the best, because it can tell us something. It can tell us if it's green, and if it can tell if it's leafy. But there's a lot of things it doesn't tell us. It's not going to tell us what the chemical analysis is. It's not going to tell us how mature it is. Of course, odor is probably a very poor means of telling the quality of forage, particularly with stored forages. Silage, determining a good quality silage goes more than just the quality of the smell of the silage, of the odor. And the same thing with other hays. Back to appearance on hay. Sometimes a mature hay will look kind of brownish on the outside, but actually on the inside it's green and leafy. So you can't always tell from the appearance. Chemical analysis is probably the best means. It's an excellent way of determining quality, as we are able to determine very clearly what the fiber levels are in the forage, as well as what the protein level is. As it gets overly mature, fiber will rise. And of course, maturity and stage of harvest is a good measure as well. We know that as a forage matures, there's going to be increased stemminess, and that's going to correlate with fiber, and we're going to be able to tell that visually. We know what stage they are. If there's a lot of seed heads, we know that a plant's gotten pretty mature. We can tell if there's stems in it. We can tell if it's leafy. And finally, plant species or variety. Well, that's not bad. We can tell between legumes and grasses, but again, it's not as good as some other measures. I think it's important to remember we're looking at feeding ruminant animals in our discussion tonight, mostly ruminants, but we're also thinking of pigs and chickens and horses a little bit, but mostly ruminants. Ruminants are what we're made to graze on pasture more than anything else. They can consume forages that are high in fiber. They will digest them, and they will turn them through the actions of those bacteria that are in the rumen, and they'll turn them into needed energy and usable protein for the animal. Here's what happens as a forage plant matures. I think this is a great little slide. You can see that if you go from the leafy stages on the left over to the full bloom stages on the right, in the leafy stage we've got the lowest fiber, and fiber correlates very well with lignin. Lignin is a chemical. We can measure that chemically, and it's one of the major components of fiber, giving it its fibrous or stemmy nature. And those are the lowest in the leafy stages. Protein's the highest. Minerals are higher at that point. As the plant matures, the forage plant matures through the boot stage, the pre-bud stage, heading bud, and all the way to bloom. You can see how the forage protein level declines and the fiber level increases. So as we go from the green and leafy stages to the blooming and stemmy stages, you can see that the protein declines, the fiber and lignin increase, and those are all going to be correlated with the forage quality. Here's another way to look at that. I like this. The green represents the contents inside of the cell: protein, the oils, minerals, sugars, organic acids, and these are all fairly digestible. So the animal consumes those, and they're digested by the animal. It's probably good to define what I mean by digestible. It means what comes in minus what goes out, divided by what went in. So if I say something is highly digestible, we're gonna say that it's something is 60% digestible or 70% digestible. That's going to mean that 70% of what they consume was actually digested by the animal. Now, if we say something's only 30% digestible, we're talking about something that's pretty low quality, and practically speaking, unless you're consuming very mature rice hulls or straw or something, you're not going to find anything that's that low in digestibility. So those cell contents are more easily digestible. The cell wall portion, the pectins, the hemicellulose, cellulose, lignin, silica, those are, as those increase in the plant, those are less digestible. And those are measured by neutral detergent fiber and acid detergent fiber. Those are two measurements, chemical measurements we have of the fiber that's in a plant cell wall. And as those increase, the intake declines and digestibility declines. So those are numbers we are aware of when we do a chemical analysis of a forage, that as they increase, NDF and ADF, intake and digestibility decline. Here's a forage analysis sheet. This was obtained from Dairy One Laboratories. Dairy One is located in Ithaca, New York, and if you're interested in having forage testing done, that's a good place to send your forage. You can find their website. It's dairy1.com. So what are some things we might look at on there? And we'll just be real brief. We'll just point a couple things out. Crude protein. Here in this particularly this pasture, this was on a pasture clipping. It was about 21%, 22% on a dry matter basis. Very high quality pasture. It's represented as crude protein, or CP, and is a measure of the nitrogen content of the feed. The animal needs has a requirement for crude protein. It's essential for normal growth and body function of all animals and for milk production. Also on that analysis, you're going to find acid detergent fiber, or as I mentioned, ADF. It's the cell wall portion of a feedstuff. Okay, it includes cellulose and lignin as primary components. The higher the ADF content, the lower the digestibility. So ADF rises, and here in this particular forage, the dry matter basis for the ADF is 32.4. That's relatively low, actually. It's for a pasture forage, that's relatively low. Anything 30 to 35 or so would be considered fairly low. Also on the forage test sheet, you're going to find neutral detergent fiber, or NDF. In this particular case, the dry matter percentage is about 55%. It also represents part of the cell wall portion, including hemicellulose, cellulose, and lignin as primary components. In general, when NDF increases, the forage dry matter intake of the feed is going to decline. Well, we can also look at that in terms of not so much in terms of chemical analysis. We can look at it in terms of forage maturity. And in this particular slide, looking at grass as it matures from, in this case, a green vegetative grass, leafy green, from crude protein of 18, ADF of 33, NDF of 55. Not too much different than the forage test sheets we just looked at. As that becomes mature, goes to seed, it heads out, it gets stemmy, turns brown to green. Crude protein is going to drop to less than 8%. ADF will be greater than 46%, NDF greater than 65%, so the quality goes down greatly. And we can see this both by the chemical tests as well as just knowing what the forage maturity is that we're looking at. An ideal time for grazing and look at these is probably the stage of when we go from the grass or vegetative stage to the early head stage. That's sometimes you'd call that the boot stage. So the early head would be, more or less equivalent to the boot stage. That's a good time to be grazing. And it's not a bad time to be cutting for hay either. You can also look at this as in terms of a legume, going from the pre-bloom stage, leafy and green. This is a stage when a lot of times dairy producers like their legumes, their alfalfa, to be cut at a very immature stage, their first cut at least. And this is this pre-bloom would be 18% crude protein, less than 31 ADF, less than 39 NDF, a pretty good quality forage. As that forage matures, it's going to be bloomed out. It's going to become very stemmy. It's going to be brown to green in color. Lower crude protein, higher ADF, higher NDF. And again, there's another slide that'll kind of help out on understanding some of this. As we go from the leafy stage of grasses all the way to the bloom, and legumes leafy to the bloom, we can see as they grow, the digestibility is declining, the intake is declining. We talked about how those are related to the forage components ADF and NDF a few moments ago, and yield is increasing. However, as at the same time yield is increasing, the quality is going down. So the ideal point. The ideal point is right in this middle area here between the boot and the head on grasses, and the pre-bud to the bud with forage legumes. It's going to be some of the best. We're going to have the kind of the best balance between forage quality with good digestibility and intake and yield. As ADF and NDF increase, as depicted in this slide, from lower levels 30, less than 31 and less than 40, digestibility and intake are going to decline as ADF and NDF increase, whereas digestibility will be less than 53% when those are lower, and the intake is going to decline at the same as well. We can look at that in terms of animal performance. When we go from the pre-bud all the way to the full bloom stage in alfalfa, crude proteins declining, ADF's increasing, digestibility declines, dry matter intake declines from 3.5% of body weight to only 2% of body weight when we go from pre-bud bud alfalfa to full bloom alfalfa. Average daily gain goes from 2.2 pounds per day down to less than a pound a day for full bloom, and the feed efficiency goes from 9 in terms of the bud, and although you can't see it, it goes up to 15 to 1 feed efficiency in the full bloom. Well, what are some guidelines for grazing grasses? Well, of course, rotational grazing is a great place to start, and I'll mention that some of our speakers in recent weeks have already talked about this, and Hank's going to go through this a little bit in a few moments, but I wanted to point out a couple things. First, to point out when you compare grazing methods of rotational versus continuous grazing, you're going to find that rotational grazing is going to result in a greater percentage of leaves in the forage, better quality forage, versus continuous grazing, and percent stand is going to be greater in a rotational grazing system than a continuous grazing. So rotational, or as we rotate our animals through pastures, it's going to promote better grass quality and better stand of the grass as well. And I like to compare this in terms of utilization. The poorest utilization of any system is the continuous system. We lose 50%, we utilize 50%. Rotational, we lose 35 and percent utilization is 65. Strip grazing is a little better, hay production is better, silage is better, and green shopping is the best of all. So I think another reason that on pasture grazing, we should be considering rotationally grazing our animals. Animals' needs will change during the course of a year, whether it's due to calving and rebreeding, or gestation or lactation. Their needs are going to change, and the example I'm going to show you here is about cows. During the course of a year, an animal's condition is going to vary. At an animal that's a 1,000-pound animal just prior to calving loses condition at calving, lose condition on into the breeding season, and will gain condition again on until weaning. Now, I mentioned these animals have numbers on them: 7, 6, 5, 6. Those refer to body condition, a subjective visual appraisal of an animal's condition. If you want to learn more about that, there's a website at the bottom, link there, a Rutgers Extension Bulletin, FS 764, where it'll describe more about body condition and how you can use a system of that with your animals during the course of a season, of a year. This is another way of expressing the same thing, that as an animal gets to calving, their nutrient requirements are going to increase during breeding and lactation. Through the end of breeding, they're going to decline through the latter part of lactation, and as gestation begins until weaning, their requirements are probably going to be, their nutrient requirements are probably going to be the least, and then gestation is going to they're going to increase again from there. So it's important to remember this, and we can balance this. We can kind of overlay this forage growth curve on top of that, and we can see that if an animal is a spring calving cow herd, then their greatest requirements are going to be more or less in the same period of time when the greatest grass growth is on these three cool season forages: tall fescue, orchard grass, and bluegrass. So they're going to produce the most forage at the time the animals are probably going to need the most energy and protein. Now, of course, that's going to decline during the summer months as we get drouthier conditions and forages kind of go dormant during a couple month period before growth rebounds again in the fall. And I think we can kind of overlay a cow's needs over that and see that some of that, especially with a spring calving cow, it's going to kind of work together. Please remember that early spring and fall growth is most abundant and should be managed intensively. If our forage grows too fast to keep up with, then it's going to become lower quality. It's going to become stemmy and go to seed. It'll be lower quality. So we need to manage things more intensively in those early spring and fall times, and we can do that by stocking animals, stocking heavier. We can clip the pastures. We can make hay. Again, I stock heavier early in the spring, lighter during the hot summer months, as is shown right here. Interseeding with clovers and legumes can improve forage energy and protein availability. That's a great thing you can do. You can grow some grass and along with clovers and legumes. Alfalfa can make a good combination and will improve forage energy and protein availability. Hay or grain supplementation, particularly hay supplementation, may be helpful in the hot summer months. Avoid tall fescue infected pastures, endophyte infected pastures. Now, you've probably heard of the term of an endophyte infected tall fescue before. The endophyte is a fungus. It gets in the plant cells and it produces some compounds during the course of its growth, during the course of the year, that can be toxic to animals. They're not probably deadly toxic, but they can cause a vasoconstriction in the blood supply, to whereas an animal during hot summer months at least has a harder time getting rid of their body heat. Just kind of a constriction in the blood, doesn't vascularize near the surface of the skin as much as it would, and it's harder for them to get rid of heat. And if we have tall fescue pastures in the hot summer months, we're going to have to supplement them in some way quite often, or keep our animals off of those kind of pastures. Summer annual grasses can provide good feed and forage in the summer. We plant those probably the latter part of June, and they make good. They can make good July, August, and September growth. They can put out a lot of dry matter in those times. Deworming may be required in the spring. As animals go on to spring pastures, those spring pastures may have some worms that are present that will infect the animals. If that's the case, you need to think about that and practice some sort of a deworming program. Finally, there's another product I sometimes recommend. It's called an ionophore, and I won't give you any trade names here, but these can be useful in improving forage digestibility. So if you're going to supplement an animal on pasture, then including an ionophore in the mix is not a bad thing to do. And if you have questions about that, please contact me or Hank or someone else on this program to find out more. Well, if you're going to use summer annual grasses, what are some grasses you might use? Sudan grass, sorghum Sudan grass, forage sorghum, millet. Now these are summer annuals. They're what we call warm season grasses. Cool season grasses are going to get the bulk of their growth in the spring and then in the fall. Warm seasons are going to have their greatest growth during the summer. July, August especially. And when we've got a shortage of forage during the summer, these summer annual grasses, if we plant a plot to them in a plot of forage to annual grasses in June or thereabouts, they can provide some good forage in the summer. And this just gives some guidelines on using those. As I just mentioned, June is a time to plant by the end of June. They can give multiple grazings between July and September. We have planted millet on our campus farm for several years now, and we found that to be good enough to give some extra forage during that period of July and August. They can give very high dry matter production during the period when they're growing. They will have a disadvantage, and that's they often have a compound called prussic acid within them. Prussic acid is a precursor of it can lead to cyanide poisoning in animals. And how do you get away from that? Always make sure that you graze your animals when your forage is greater than 18 inches high. Don't graze below that. And if you're going to green chop, it's got to be green chopped when it's more mature and taller as well. Don't ever let your animals graze when they're hungry, because they'll go in and they'll eat too much and be at a greater risk. Don't graze during or after a drought. I think that prussic acid can kind of concentrate. Do not graze after a frost. If you're going to make silage, and of course these summer annuals produce a lot of dry matter, and you can use them to produce silage or baleage. I think even is sometimes done. You should allow 1 to 2 months at least before after you make silage, ensile them before feeding. And prussic acid is not really a concern with millet. Nitrates can also be a concern. They will concentrate, especially during droughts. So if you've got a drouthy year, the summer annuals will concentrate nitrates and should be probably avoided during those periods. It can be made worse by heavy nitrogen fertilization or manure applications, will cause even more concentration of nitrates. Don't let animals graze the lower 1/3 of the stalk, especially during a drought. And Rutgers has a nice fact sheet on this. You can look on their website to find that about nitrates. How about legumes? Is it possible to graze legumes? Now, of course, some people are going to say grazing legumes, at least a pure stand of legume like an alfalfa, they're going to say no, there's too much risk about bloat. Well, alfalfa has a lot of versatile use. You can use it for hay, for silage, for grazing. It's excellent quality. It can result in some of the highest levels of yield per acre and animal production per acre. It's got a deep-rooted root system, and it's probably more drought tolerant than cool season legumes and grasses. Provides a great, or can provide a good summer pasture. Of course, grass legume mixtures are always appropriate. Whether you may have a grass stand and interseed clovers or some kind of legume with the grass stand. You can have reduced machinery cost. If you're grazing alfalfa, you're not going to need as much equipment to put up hay, and you're going to lower your fertilizer expense. Of course, legumes will fix nitrogen from the atmosphere, and they can turn it into protein in a growing legume. Grasses can't do that. So to get adequate nitrogen on a pure grass stand, you're going to have to do some fertilization with nitrogen. Whereas if you have legumes in the mix, you may not have to add any nitrogen at all. So what are some guidelines? And these are basically how to prevent bloat if that's going to be a concern. First, this is the first guideline to remember. First thing to remember, don't graze your animals when they're hungry. If they are turned into a legume pasture to graze when they're hungry, they're going to overeat and they're going to be at a risk of bloat. Wait until the forages are more mature, before you graze them on the legume. Don't do it at a pre-bloom or anything. Wait till they're blooming. Limit intake however you can. You might have to graze them for a portion of the day, but not the entire day. Provide grain or hay if needed as well. Don't graze early in the morning. There's dew on the forages in the morning, heavy dew. Don't graze after rain. That's just going to increase the concerns about bloat. Of course, the condition of bloat is when legumes, or in this case alfalfa, get in the rumen of the animal. The fermentation occurs in the rumen, and you're going to get a lot of foam, a potential foaming within the rumen, and it's going to limit the animal's ability to belch, or their ability to eructate, pass gas. It'll block off the relief valve in the rumen for them to be able to pass their gas. It'll block it, and they're going to just swell up. So if you've seen a bloated animal a bloated cow that's had too much legume, you'll see that the left side of the animal is blown up like a balloon almost. They're very swelled, and if it gets bad enough, it can kill the animal. When you rotate between paddocks, always make your changes midday or later. Don't do morning changes. Do it in the midday when they've already eaten, and if you do that early in the morning, they're likely to maybe consume too much. You can always feed a bloat preventing product or an ionophore. There are some on the market. They will reduce the concerns about both bloat, reduce the incidence. And as I've mentioned several times already, mixtures between legumes and grasses are good options. Don't ever graze after a killing frost. So if it's in the fall and you have a killing frost, wait at least a week before you graze again. How about some other forages? Well, there's some other species that can be tried, and one of the majors of these are brassicas, rape, kale, and turnips. We've tried turnips on campus before for grazing, and these generally will give pretty good fall growth. I think they have to be planted by early September at the latest. You'd want them to be planted, and then they're going to give good growth in October, November, and even December. They'll be able to support grazing animals, and at times I think even the roots are, the animals will consume the roots as well. Adapt your animals slowly from summer pastures to brassicas. Don't let brassicas. Don't let them eat too much of the brassicas. Hungry animals turned out, you should avoid that as well. There are some concerns with managing the brassicas properly. There's a website I've put in here that should give you some guidelines in using the brassicas. Just a overview about forage harvests for hay and silage. Alfalfa, you cut at the bud stage in the first cut, and then 1/10 bloom for second and later cuttings. For spring seedlings, allow the first cutting to reach mid bloom. The clovers, early bloom or 1/2 bloom. Orchard grass, timothy and fescue, boot to early head stage for first cut. Aftermath cutter growths as intervals allow, or maybe 4 to 6 weeks. When to harvest your forage crops again, small grains, boot to the early head stage. And for Sudan grass and the hybrids, this is for silage or green chop, 36 to 48 inch heights or early boot stage, whichever comes first. These are some of the values for dry matter, crude protein, ADF, NDF, and TDN or energy from the Dairy One Forage Testing Laboratory. These are averages from 2000 to 2019 for cool season grasses. Protein averaged 15.8% over that time. Acid detergent fiber was 35.6%, and neutral detergent fiber was 60.9%. That's the average of the cool season grasses that came through their lab. Where can you get some testing done? You can go to the Cumberland Valley Analytical Services, foragelab.com, or the Dairy One Laboratory, dairy1.com. In closing, I want you to remember a little bit of what we talked about here related to forage growth and cultural practices and the requirements of your livestock. We need to manage in such a way that we maximize our forage yields and our forage quality. And as we look at the growth patterns of our forages during the course of a year and the requirements of our livestock, we want to be able to balance the two. So we maximize forage production at the same time as our animals have their greatest requirements for energy and protein. So if we approach it with that way, we will be able to affect how we manage our forages and our animals, and hopefully we will maximize the use of our forages, and we'll get maximum intake, growth, and performance from our animals. Thank you very much.
Okay. Well, thanks, Mike. That was great. I was like listening to your presentation. So tonight, I'm going to be talking about grazing systems and then touching on a few animal husbandry practices to be aware of when you're pasturing your animals. So in the last previous sessions, grazing systems were briefly discussed. So tonight, we're just going to go a little more into detail on some of these systems for your livestock species, more based on a production model. So there are many different grazing systems to put in place on your operation. And last week, when Dr. Williams was talking about what to do with your horse pastures, and she said the famous extension answer that most extension agents give, it depends, and she was right. So it definitely depends on your situation. How much acreage do you have? How much labor help do you have access to? What's your production costs, and what are your goals? So there's a bunch of different grazing systems, and Dr. Wissendorf touched on a few of them in his presentation, but the first one is continuous grazing. And typically when people are beginning farmers and they're talking about, oh, I'm going to be grazing my animals, I have a bunch of acreage and I'm going to let my animals graze. That's typically what they're talking about. Continuous grazing is when livestock graze in a pasture for extended amount of time with no infrequent rest to the plants from grazing. So they're not divided into sub-pastures or paddocks. They're allowed access in the pasture at any given time. So this system clearly involves a very low level of labor and management. It also requires very little expense in fencing materials and other exterior fences, or other than the exterior fence, sorry. The water system can be minimal as well. But there's also some disadvantages. So you're potentially going to see uneven grazing patterns, a variable plan of nutrition. So animals are going to eat the best forage they find first, then they're going to move to the lower quality. You're going to have uneven distribution of manure. There's going to be a change in pasture composition over time, favoring plants that are not readily grazed. So that sounds like weeds. And then your overly mature forages in much of the pasture are going to result into negative energy status. And Mike just talked about why the importance of the different components of the forage for the different component stages of life for livestock production. And then you have rotational grazing, and there's a lot of subsets within rotational grazing, but it's the practice of moving grazing livestock between pastures, typically called paddocks, as needed on a regular basis. So there's definitely different approaches and types of grazing that fall under this umbrella. There may be only a few paddocks and livestock that are moved every couple of weeks, or there could be many paddocks and livestock that are moved, every couple of days. Depending on how often the livestock are moved will dictate whether it's called rotational grazing, or we're going to talk about in the next slide, intensive grazing. So temporary fencing materials are available that make rotational grazing easy and inexpensive. The basic premise with rotational grazing is that it will allow the pasture plants to rest and then regrow before being grazed again. So other advantages would be including placing livestock on a more even plane of nutrition as compared to a continuous grazing plan. It's more drought resistant in the pasture. You're going to get more total pounds of dry matter produced in a season compared to continuous grazing, and a more stable pasture composition. So some disadvantages, it takes more labor than continuous grazing to set up paddocks. It could be more expensive for the temporary fencing materials and the infrastructure that you might need to provide, and you're going to need water in all your paddocks. Again, it comes down to what your goal is for your operation and what's your production plan. So the next slide is about management intensive grazing. Pretty much it's a more structured system where you're going to be moving your animals more frequently. So maybe every 1 to 4 days. Generally, this requires many permanent pastures in place and then temporary fencing to create smaller paddocks. So benefits of intensive grazing might include more complete use of plant material. You're going to have better consumption of less preferred forages and some weeds. You're going to have less hoof damage than, say, in a confinement housing situation. You'll have less eye irritation than in like a weedy pasture. There's going to be more even spreading of animal waste over the pastures, which will then lead to less runoff or less nutrient runoff into the streams and the river, and more forage feed produced per acre. So you'll also have I know some producers have, will stockpile. So the concept of stockpiling is pretty simple. Instead of cutting or drying or storing your hay to feed in the winter, you can grow your pasture forage until frost and then let the animals harvest their own feed as late into the winter as weather conditions allow. And that could be a challenge within itself, especially being in the Northeast and in New Jersey. Winters lately don't seem like they're consistent. But most classes of livestock can graze through, I guess, 8 inches of snow or so, and are comfortable in colder temperatures, especially cattle, because of that rumen, they can keep warmer, but they're going to eat more. But just like everything in pasture management, it's more complicated in the practice. Successful stockpiling is a result of planning, timing, and some luck. There are 2 main reasons given for stockpiling. The first and obvious one would be it replaces, harvesting stored feed, and it's a little bit cheaper. So it should save you money. And the other reason is that it can improve your pasture utilization the following season by staggering spring and early summer grass growth. So 50% or more of your pasture growth occurs during the spring flush. Making hay off some acres is the most common way to deal with this overabundance. So the idea behind stockpiling is that the winter grazing of some paddocks can help stage paddocks to accumulate forage at different rates in the spring. And then Mike was talking about strip grazing. So this technique involves utilizing a movable electric fence to allot enough forage for a short period of time, then moving the fence forward, providing a new allocation of forage. So typically, no back fencing is used in this method. So the grazing should start in the area that's closest to the water. So in this picture, you see the group of cows, and that blue dot is your water. And so essentially, you're opening up each section so that they can go back to get the water. But if you start at the corner, work your way back up, you're just going to lose your quality of forage from trampling. Stockpile can also be utilized during certain times of the year when grazing specific forage species like alfalfa in the late fall when it's resting. The forage is not an issue. And this method can also be in combination with rotational grazing. And then your grazing height. So this is important to keep a close eye on your pastures as livestock are grazing. And often a drive-by evaluation of pasture is not good enough. So you want to go check out your fields. And you can see this on the slide. There's this handy multicolor tool. It's called the grazing stick. That will determine when to let animals on and off your pasture or your paddock. So in the spring, when conditions are favorable for cool season grasses, it can seem simple to graze and get regrowth of forages after the animals have been rotated to a new paddock in a rotational grazing system. But as the growing season progresses, the temperatures become warmer, the cool season forage growth slows. Mike was showing us that on some of his slides. And so then the grazing management becomes even more critical if adequate pasture regrowth is desired. So typically a grazing residue height, you're looking at maybe 3 to 4 inches in the cool season perennial grasses. It's typically recommended. When the summer hits and the temperatures increase, your forage growth is going to slow. And oftentimes the precipitation slows. So, when we have droughts when there's no rain. So if the grass is grazed to 1.5 inches stubble, there will likely only be 1.5 inches of root mass below that soil surface. And this isn't adequate for a root system for forages to seek water, especially during this high heat and stress because of water deficiency. So it's recommended that during those times when you don't have access to water and temperatures are high, that a grazing residue height is about 4 to 4.5 inches typically is ideal. And this allows the forage to have adequate root system to seek out the nutrients necessary for regrowth during times of stress. And in the fall, as the season change and the temperatures begin to get cooler, the pasture regrowth of the cool season perennials will jump once again. And the plants are preparing to go dormant for the winter months. So it's critical to not graze too close to the soil surface for that final grazing in the fall before winter. And Mike pretty much explained that in his slides. So when it gets down to about 3 inches, make sure that the livestock are being rotated to a pasture. You want to have it at least 6 to 8 inches of forage growth and allow the previous grazed pastures adequate time to regrow. So essentially, I've heard the phrase, take half, leave half. Kind of want to give the pasture a break so that it can regrow and then you're not starting from scratch. So now at this point, I just want to briefly touch on some animal husbandry issues. Since I've been asked or called, I've been called about this a bunch of times in the past, especially when I worked in upstate New York. I would get this call multiple times. Why would I need a handling facility? My animals are on pasture. Or I would get the call from the vet saying, can you please do a presentation on why it's important to have handling facilities if you have livestock, especially if you're on the pasture? If you can't catch your animals, a vet's not going to come make a house call. And having a catching chute and scales are a low-cost investment in the scheme of things when you are working out your production costs. So first of all, they help with safety, not only for restraining the animals, but the safety for you and your employees. If you need to do pregnancy checks or you need to deworm or do vaccinations or even just weigh your animals, essentially for meat animal production, your end product is a carcass. So the meat business is based on rate of gain. So having an inexpensive set of scales to weigh your animals periodically to see if your nutrition plan is working sounds like a good idea to me. And briefly talking about fencing, I know we talked about this in some of the grazing systems, but depending on your operation, it's going to determine your fencing situation. So factors for selecting fencing type can include affordability, maintenance, durability, effectiveness of containing livestock. Fencing types vary from physical barriers and um, like woven wire and board fences to physiological barriers such as electrified polywire or tape or high tensile electric fences are a combination of both barrier types. And then briefly talking about shelter, having some kind of protection during inclement weather will make your animals happy and keep them healthy. I'm not recommending building a brand new barn with heated floors, but just something to keep them dry and protect them from the wind. And so silvopasturing, I'm not going to get too into silvopasturing, but it's an agroforestry practice where a combination of trees, forage, and livestock are jointly managed to optimize production of all three. Silvopasture can be established either by planting trees in existing pasture or by planting forages in existing stand of trees. For this example, it can help as a barrier for some sort of shelter. But I've definitely gotten calls before where people have acres of woods and they just decide to throw their animals in the woods because now it's considered a silvopatcher. But I would do a lot of research before you decide to do that. And if you're just throwing animals in the woods with no other feed source, you're going to destroy your woods. And then also, water is super important. So we talked about all these different grazing systems, and if you're going to intensely rotate and graze your animals, and you're going to have multiple paddocks, you need to have access. You have to have multiple water sources. So you either have to have the water or have the animals go to water or bring the water to them. So depending on what your feasibility or what you have access to, you need to think about that before you put in a plan of action. And essentially, if you have ponds and streams, you want to make sure that you're not degrading that water source. Just because you have the stream doesn't mean that you don't have to worry about water. Worst case scenario, you can fence out a piece of it so that the animals have access, but they're not going to destroy that water source. I've seen people pump out some water, but you just want to, keep the environment safe and friendly as well. And then if you need to bring water to your animals in your different paddocks, you can easily take inexpensive items on your farm and have multiple water sources. Beef cows and dairy cows, especially if they're lactating, require a lot of water per day. So making sure that your animals have access to water is super vital for their production. And then quickly, the first seminar or session of Pasture 101, I talked about estimating forage yields for pasture. Essentially, this just ties it in on depending on your grazing system will determine your forage yield with your soil health. And then this will determine your livestock's nutrition plan. So will you have enough feed to feed your animals, or are you going to need to supplement? Again, depending on the management system and your health of your soil is going to determine what your yields for your forage the forage yields for your pasture. And that is it. If you guys have any questions after this presentation, feel free to send me an email. If there are suggestions for future presentations, that you will let us know what you're interested in. Have a great night.